Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to the speakers. Today is the second webinar of our webinar series, Sustainable Recovery and the Law by Which Means. This is an initiative of the Economic Law Research Unit and of the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies. The goal of this webinar series is to discuss with students and practitioners how the law can contribute to better achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement objectives in the economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And today's webinar couldn't be more timely. Only yesterday we woke up with an EU climate law and a European list of environmentally sustainable economic activities. And as we speak, world leaders are spending Earth Day at the drawing table, thanks to the initiative of the US presidency. So do we have reasons to be optimistic? Let's find out. Without further ado, I welcome Professor Delbeke, who needs little introduction. He's professor at the KU Leuven and climate chair of the European Investment Bank. He's former director general for the climate action at the European Commission, and he's here to discuss the financial and economic perspectives. As an organizational point, I must put you on notice that we are recording this session and that we have to excuse Professor Delbeke for the Q&A. So therefore, we will put a short 5 minutes Q&A session after the presentation. So you can put your questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand. So good evening, Professor Delbeke, and you have the floor.
Good evening, and it is a real pleasure on this very special day to be online with all of you. Special day for the reasons you indicated, and as we speak, the world is gathering and hopefully some new and ambitious commitments are going to come out of this meeting today. In any case, the United States is back on board, and I think that's very important. Sorry for my time constraint this evening, but I'm very pleased that we can have a little Q&A, and I promise not to eat into the time of Professor Deketelaere, who will complement my talk afterwards. So on the next slide, what I'm intending to do today is that we go into the EU and the world, some facts and figures, that we go into the European Green Deal. Professor Deketelaere is going to deal most with that, but I will emphasize the investments because it is a big investment program, basically, spoken as an economist. And then there is a raft of climate policy measures, and I would like to highlight 3 of them just as an illustration, but there is more to do, but time is short today, and I wanted to draw your attention to those 3. So on the next slide, you know, what are the facts and figures? Well, if we put ourselves in a time perspective of not a few years or decades or centuries, but millennia, that is the graph that is showing between today and 22,000 years ago. So the mark of 0 is the Roman time. So this is the geological cycle we are currently in, and we are at the end of the Holocene. Some would say we have left the Holocene and we are in the Anthropocene. But what is important, and that is the red line you see at the end, that is giving the temperature increase over the last 100 years. And you see with the naked eye how much the trend has been broken and how much the warming is currently already taking place, 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer compared to pre-industrial times. Now, where does this come from? On the next slide, that is shown where the global emissions are today coming from. And these are the emissions from different emitters, countries. And if you look well into the graph, it all started with the Industrial Revolution. We were digging coal out of the underground. We were emitting through the use of coal greenhouse gas emissions. And today we primarily do that through the use of oil and gas. In fact, as of the 1960s, 70s, the old industrial world, which is Europe and the United States, were seeing a leveling off of their emissions. But then started what are the red zones, an additional number of countries, the emerging countries, and in particular China as a big element, a new element in the entire emissions pattern. And that is the problem we are struggling with today. we are emitting a lot of emissions. But on top of that, there is a new emerging world that is in particular, as of the year 2000, responsible for a dramatic increase in emissions. So that's why, on the next slide, that's why we need an agreement, a multilateral agreement where the world acts together. And we have that under the Paris Agreement. And all countries have committed to make their plans. And we know as of today that the world is the glass is half full or half empty. Half empty because we know we are not currently coming where we should be coming. We should be coming at 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius maximum heating compared to the pre-industrial times. And today we are at 3 degrees Celsius with the Paris Agreement. Now, the good news is that without the Paris Agreement, we would probably be close to 5 degrees Celsius, but the 3 degrees Celsius is not good enough. And that is why it is so important today on Earth Day that we have the Americans coming back, but also probing and pressing other countries to make fresh commitments. And on the next slide, in fact, the EU started in doing that in 2019, where they were the first in the world to declare themselves climate neutral by 2050. And they translated that into an updated target of 55% reduction by 2030. But the more and most important thing is that the EU triggered other major players in the world. And the first one to jump was a little bit of a surprise. It was China in 2020 that declared itself to be carbon neutral by 2060, 10 years later than the Europeans, but still a fabulous commitment of a big country that is today responsible for a third of global emissions. And the good news is that today confirmed, the United States is also putting itself on that trajectory of net zero emissions by 2050. And they declared themselves to halve their emissions today compared to 2030. And in the wake of those European, Chinese, and American commitments, more important is that many countries are joining the club. We have Japan, Korea, South Africa, more than 60 countries today declaring themselves carbon neutral one way or the other by 2050. And that is a major revival of the commitments and a refreshment of the commitments under the Paris Agreement. So in this entire context, what is the vision of the European Union? Well, it is a really multilateral vision. We are responsible for the climate change that is currently happening today. But the climate change that we are going to see in the future of our children and grandchildren is going to be created by the emerging economies primarily. And so it is good that we are hanging together, that all countries make commitments, and Europe has declared itself to be willing to be the first mover. Of course, there is the climate responsibility. What we see today, we are primarily responsible for the climate change of today. But there is also economic opportunity because we are going to come forward with new innovations on the way we produce commodities, the way we transport ourselves. And so there is a lot of economic opportunity, and the first ones being there may be the ones reaping the benefits. And so Europe is becoming a bit of a laboratory for low carbon technologies, but they do not fall out of heaven. We do need for that low carbon policies. And I think when we put those two together, policies and technologies, I think Europe is really a first mover with the Green Deal. And on the next slide is indicated that the Green Deal is in fact a new comprehensive economic strategy. It's not only energy, industry, but also increasingly agriculture, transport. You know, it is spreading all over all policy areas of the European Union. And that's good because to be frank, I think we have spent now enough time on setting targets. Now, setting targets on itself does not reduce emissions. It is only policies that reduce emissions. And, you know, there is a bit of a bidding process on the targets, and that's all good and well, as long as they drive policies forward. And that is what the Green Deal in Europe is doing. Now, in the financial system, and as Professor Van Kanahem was indicating, in the financial system, we see already very important developments. Sustainable finance, we just decided on a green taxonomy. We all know how difficult that is, what is really green and what is less green. Let's not go into that, but is gas, the use of natural gas green, is the use of nuclear energy green? So very complicated elements that have delayed the adoption of the taxonomy, but now it's there. It has been adopted yesterday. So the financial system is greening itself. And on the next slide, I made a few estimates on what the investment challenges are under the Green Deal. Now, only in the energy sector, we need 350 billion euros of additional annual investment in that sector to roll out the new technologies. We know them, we know what they are. It is about storage, about batteries, about renewables, about the digital development. But in the energy sector, we will see in the next decade a massive rollout of clean technologies that we need to deliver the targets that Europe has set for itself by 2030. In industry, the activity is as important, but the rollout of new innovations is not going to be there as of yet, because these new low carbon innovations, they are very complicated. We talk about hydrogen, we talk about ammonia, we talk about completely different production systems in steel, in cement, in chemicals. We talk about biomass and the biochemicals that are gaining ground as fast as we speak. So industry will have to crack the nut between now and 2030 so as to be able to roll out the low carbon innovations as massively as of 2030. So a huge investment challenge, first on the rollout of energy and in the creation of new technologies. Now we are still in a post-COVID recession world, and there are lots of policies that are going to be developed, and Europe has taken the lead with a budget and what is absolutely new, the Next Generation EU, the recovery fund, the post-COVID recovery fund, of a drastic increase of resources that is going to be spent in Europe. We talk about 1,800 billion euros. It's a massive amount. And what is important is that there is a strong commitment that a third, so some 600 billion euros, will be spent in relation to the climate neutral objectives that have been set. And so this 30% is an absolute opportunity, apart from the fact that no technology can go against reaching the targets, and also that a part of the revenues from the ETS are likely going to be used to pay back the loans that the Next Generation EU fund is going to create. So the post-COVID policy should help us, and should help us in a big manner. And that is already on its way, as those who are involved in the planning in Belgium know all too well. On the next slide, I tried to sketch out perhaps the core graph of the European Commission's impact assessment. And you see in 1990, we started with the red line to reduce the emissions considerably. Today, we are 24% below 1990. And still the GDP has not been going down. And we want to continue this trend of declining emissions and increasing the wealth generation, the GDP. So there is no contradiction between emission reduction and economic growth. And you see in the shaded areas that it is the blue zone, which is the energy sector, that by 2030 is going to have disappeared almost completely in the generation of emissions. The red zone and the green zone are a bit slower. That's industry and transport. And it is mainly after 2030 that they will reduce their emissions. So the decoupling reality is a very important one. And it helped us a lot to convince, for example, the Chinese, when we were in Paris making the agreement, that to convince them that there is no, per definition, contradiction between economic growth and the diminution or the declining of the emissions. So on the next slide, let's zoom in on the raft of policy measures that the EU has developed so far. Of course, there is the ETS, the emissions trading system. I'm going to spend a few minutes on that. There is the renewables policy, but there is a lot happening in the energy field, energy efficiency, taxation, energy taxation, car emissions, fluorinated gases. These are the gases in equipment for air conditioning and heat pumps. So very important, because this is the future. The targets for member states, etc., etc. So you can find more explanation on all this on the website of the Commission. But let's zoom in on 3 specific policies. And on the next slide, I'm zooming in on the emissions trading system. Has got a history as of now. It started in 2005, so it's only 15, 16 years old. We had a bit of trouble in getting the prices right, because you see, when we got into the curve, the post Lehman Brothers crisis, say 2010 until 2018, we had low prices. Prices were not higher than some €5 per ton of carbon dioxide. But today, the prices have got a record, as we speak today, of €47 per ton of carbon dioxide. And so what is the purpose? That is that the sectors covered, and the sectors covered are energy and industry, some 40% of all emissions in the EU, that these companies covered by the sector have to pay for their pollution. It is the polluter pays principle. And we tried, and I worked together with Professor Deketelaere in the early days on a carbon energy tax. But we got stuck because taxes are very difficult politically to give shape. And so in the European Union, on top of that, taxes are decided with unanimity. So we could not get taxes created at the European level. And so instead of setting the price, we were setting the maximum quantity of pollution. And we were leaving it to the market to set the price for this declining amount of pollution. And so every year, the amount of allowed pollution is going down with 2.2%. And with the new target of 55%, this 2.2% will be increased. We will see what the Commission is going to propose, but easily up to 3.5%. Some would even say up to 4% annual reduction of the cap. So prices today are important. The emission reductions on the next slide have been delivered in a massive manner. Between the start and 2020, the emissions on the covered installations were reduced by 1/3, and the production was not going down. The production was maintained or even was going up. And over the last year, now that the prices are significantly high, we reduced the emissions under the system with another 14% in 1 year only. Of course, the COVID helped as well. There are always several factors, but the point is that the emissions trading system has been delivering emission reductions. And in the next slide is indicated how much is being debated again. The Commission will come with a proposal, and for sure, the carbon price as a new element is going to figure there as an important element, because there is a share of the allowances that is given for free to industries who are exposed to international competition. And so reducing that free allocation is something that is in the air, but is going to be very, very difficult, because there is the carbon leakage. If our companies suffer from a competitive disadvantage, they want to have that corrected. And so far, free allocation worked well. But there is now a new proposal in the making by the Commission, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, say a tax at the border, when commodities enter into the EU, and they would be taxed for the embedded carbon in the products imported. A very hot potato, because the exporters to the EU are not going to be very enthusiastic. And we heard already the Chinese and the Russians and even the United States not being very enthusiastic about that measure that is on the table. Another issue is the widening of the scope of the ETS, road transport, heating, waste incineration, the maritime sector, and international aviation are all big sectors that are on the table. So to be sure and to be short, the ETS is working, is delivering emission reductions, is going to remain important because the price is going to be high, but also the scope is going to be widened. So on the next slide, let's go into the second measure I wanted to go into, because for the Belgian listeners, there has been some animosity about solar panels and where to put windmills and how we have been or have not been sufficient in delivering renewable energy. But that is going to become an even more important measure of the EU. We doubled the amount of renewables in a good 10 years between 2008 and 2020. And we are going to see quite likely another doubling from 20% to something, we will see what the Commission is going to propose, but close to 40% of primary energy production in the EU. So that's a quite staggering figure. And also Belgium will have to do its bit of this very ambitious program. Now, the good news is that the prices for renewables have been going down and the need for subsidies has been reduced dramatically. So you know that on solar panels, for example, you make already a good case when you put them on your roof, and the subsidy that you are likely to get or not get is a very marginal element in the overall cost figure. So renewable energy, successful policy will continue because the costs of renewables have gone down dramatically, and coupled with storage and the digital developments, it is the booming sector for the energy production in Europe and in Belgium. And the third measure I wanted to highlight is on the next slide, is the efforts that have been assigned to the member states for all emissions outside the ETS. The ETS is a harmonized system, is a European system. Say the Port of Antwerp and the big installations are falling under the European system, not under the Belgian system or under the Flemish system, but on the effort sharing, that's different. And that is the other big half of the emissions. And the efforts have been differentiated according to the levels of wealth of the different member states. So the richer you are, the more you have to reduce. And so the richest member states, being Luxembourg and Sweden, have to reduce their emissions with 40% compared to Romania and Bulgaria, who can keep the level that they are currently having. Of course, this is under the assumption of the 40% target for 2050, and these figures will be reviewed upwards as soon as the 55% becomes operational. And so where is Belgium? Belgium has to reduce its emissions outside the ETS with 35% by 2030 based on 2005. And we all know that in Belgium as a whole, but in particular in Flanders, we are not yet delivering these emission reductions. And so the reviewed targets that are being agreed upon are going to be a quite difficult nut to crack. And I think this is also a wake-up call, because lots of the funds that are available in Europe and are available in the post-COVID recession package is going to be linked, as I said, to climate efforts. So on the next slide, what can we expect in the coming months? The climate law, as it was mentioned, has just been adopted, but it has not yet been formally adopted. It was the last negotiation, the trilogues, you know, the established negotiations between the Commission, the Parliament and the Council that were coming to an agreement, so to a compromise. And now the legal finalization still has to happen, but the 55% for 2030 is now almost formally agreed. It is politically agreed, and the legislative process will not create problems. Now the Commission is now proposing on the 23rd of June, 8 proposals, a whole package to review and implement this 55%. It is about stricter targets for the ETS, for the effort sharing, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, renewables, energy efficiency, the energy tax, CO2 from cars, and LULUCF, which are removals in the forestry and the agricultural sector. So a huge package that is on the table of the first Vice President Timmermans today. And there is all my former colleagues are at work almost like fools to have the delivery of the package ready by the 23rd of June, because this is really a huge package that we will expect. And it is so important to deliver, to implement the 55% agreed by the Commission. So the next slide, what can we conclude from the European perspective? Well, perhaps 5 points. First, it is important that all noses are put in the same direction. Globally, we did it under the Paris Agreement. In Europe, we have the Council, the Parliament, the Member States, and also at subnational levels, the federal states, and we are living in a federal state, have to put the noses in the same direction. Second is that a gradual introduction is part of real life. The action in the streets is calling for immediate action, immediate delivery. Now, that is hard to deliver because you have to start with a measure, to tighten it up, to make sure the delivery is constant. And so a gradual delivery of the emission reductions is the brutal reality of life. The third conclusion is that it is absolutely important that everybody needs to be involved, including those who are at the losing end of the climate policy. The distributive effects become more biting and more important, and I would even say that the 55% is impossible to deliver if the politics is not going to find ways to bring the potentially impacted of the policies on board and compensating them. The fourth element is that a price on carbon, the polluter pays, that guides efficiency and delivers massive emission reductions as we are currently seeing. And the fifth element is that innovation is key. And low carbon innovation in our companies is key because it is there that the nuts are being cracked. It is there that electric vehicles or batteries or hydrogen or carbon capture and storage or renewables are being produced. And in order to enable that, also the public authorities have to secure the infrastructure for that. So huge investment programs, for example, in piping carbon dioxide around or hydrogen around is going to be of increasing importance. So that would be my conclusion. And as a last slide, for all those who would like to dig into more factual information, I was writing a book with Peter Vis, and that book is free downloadable through open access on the website that you are seeing. So no need to make expenses. The information is available to all of you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Delbeke, for that very insightful presentation. I recall that the efforts of the Commission are unprecedented at this level, and that we also have some patience as to the rollout of the entire programs, and that our colleagues from the Environmental Law Department will have some reading to do as well in the coming months. So, as said, I will now turn to the questions. We have 2 questions in the chat. The first one is, are the ETS prices really high enough? So the UN estimates that the minimum carbon price for a 2-degree target should have been 34 to 68 euros. In 2020, it should go up every year. Stern and Stiglitz say that rising to $100 per ton by 2030 for all emissions. CE Delft concludes that if politicians decide to put their shoulders behind the policies required to secure the 2 degrees target, carbon prices will rise substantially into 2030. They will already have to be between $100 and $500, end quote. And moreover, the ETS covers less than 50% of the EU economy. Can we do better and will we do better?
Okay, well, on the pricing, of course, there is a little bit of nervousness that the prices have gone up with a factor of almost 10 between 2017 and today. So that's a quite enormous price increase that our companies have to cope with. And some of them are struggling with that. Of course, they have a savings account. They have lots of free allocation. They have savings from the past. So they can cope with this for now. The price level that we are expecting, I'm not making a forecast, I think needs to be in the price range that Stern Stiglitz was indicating, between $50 and $100 per ton of carbon dioxide. We are now already in that price zone. And why is that? Why am I saying that? And why are they saying that? First, in the energy sector, you need prices of around 40 euros to switch away from coal towards low carbon ways of producing electricity, away from coal towards gas and towards renewables. The major subsidy for renewables of the future is going to be through the carbon market. So that fuel switching is already actively happening. Talk to the Poles, the Romanians, the Bulgarians who still have coal in their energy mix, they will confirm that. And we see dramatic changes in the energy landscape of countries that still have coal. Now there is a second range, and that is in industry where making hydrogen and carbon capture and storage profitable may require a price range, roughly speaking, around 75 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. And I think we are going into that price range because we need hydrogen, we need carbon capture and storage, we need low chemicals, we need low carbon chemicals, low carbon cement, low carbon steel, commodities that we use in huge quantities. So yes, I would expect that we are going to the price range of around 75 euros per ton. You mentioned also price ranges of 100 up to 500 euros, etc. I'm not sure. You know, these mechanical models of economists have to be taken with a little bit of salt and pepper, because we have a dynamic reaction. If carbon is becoming expensive, then companies do efforts to reduce their carbon emissions. So there is a reaction to the price level. And I think that is what we are seeing when the renewables come into the market and the fuel switching that is happening. That is having a dampening effect on the price. So on the one hand, the cap is going to become tighter. On the other hand, the market is going to do its job. And so I would not think that prices 500 euros or whatever are going to be there in any time soon. You know, I'm not saying anything about 2050, you know, that is very heroic to make, you know, price forecasts for that period. I'm talking in the range between now and 2030, where I think we are going to see the prices in a range between 40, 50, 70, 80 euros per ton. That's my best guess. But, you know, I have not a glazed ball. I cannot forecast that. On the fact that the scope of the ETS is going down, that's indeed a problem, because as the ETS is successful, emissions are pushed out. And so the scope of the ETS is shrinking. So that is why the proposals of the Commission to extend the scope of the ETS to heating fuels, transport fuels, the maritime sector, the aviation sector, despite the fact that there is a system developed by ICAO, I think makes a lot of sense. Also, and more fundamentally, what the ETS has to do is, in the next decade, is to prepare a reward system for removals. Because if carbon dioxide is being stored in forests or in the land through agricultural actions, there is not yet a reward through the ETS on that. But the removals is a completely different, mechanic compared to reducing emissions in the energy or the industry sector. So there is a lot more work to be done. So to cut it short, in the short term, we will see the extension of the ETS. In the medium term, we will have to expand the scope for rewarding removals.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Before I go to the last question, and please stop me if you have to, Professor Delbeke.
That's fine.
Ask for a quick reaction of Professor Deketelaere. I don't know if you want to jump.
Well, just begin on what Jos was saying, this change in the scope of the ETS. It's an interesting point to see if the prices are rising now in a very significant way, and we are going to shift activities which are now in the non-ETS to the ETS, and revenues go to member states. What is your evaluation, Jos, about the financial stream that this is going to generate for member states? Is this something that also can be used in domestic policies then? Is this going to be substantial, or how do you look at that?
Well, I think this is going to be a subject of political debate, because we are heavy transport users and it's going to generate more revenues. I think as it stands now, the revenues go to the member states. But the next generation EU fund is going to have to be paid back. And I would assume a debate coming about these additional revenues, how to use part of it to pay back the post-COVID-19 recovery fund on the one hand, and to share part of the revenues with the member states for their national policies. So I expect a debate, a more intensive debate on the revenues. Now, there is one caveat into that. I think we work together on the energy tax directive, the carbon energy tax directive in the 1990s. Today we have the excise duty, the energy tax directive, and there may be a review of the minimum rates, but we know this is subject to unanimity. Yeah. So it may take a long time before unanimity is being found to review these minimum rates. And so an alternative could be to use the ETS and to have a carbon complement on the energy complement that is covered by the energy tax directive. So we would come close to the carbon energy tax that we discussed in the past, where the energy tax directive is catering for the joule content of energy products. And on top of that, the carbon content is catered for through the ETS. So the world is coming, or the circle is getting rounded, if you look at it this way,
They're finally ready for it, so.
Indeed.
Then I see that there's a last question. It's rather broad. How to overcome carbon leakage in non-ETS sectors, for example, in our agriculture?
That's a very tricky question, because if you go outside Europe, you go to Australia or New Zealand or United States or Brazil, they would say, but you subsidize your agricultural system. So what are you talking about leakage? So it's the other way around. You are subsidizing, and I'm not yet talking about putting a carbon element or a carbon tax or a carbon charge on activities in the agricultural sector. So I think we have to have a second look at the way we are organizing our common agricultural policy and the way we are organizing our forest policies. And the Commission is going to come, as I understood, with fresh guidelines on the LULUCF, the land use change and forestry, the way the emissions are being counted, and hopefully the way they are going to be rewarded. because on the cap on the agriculture, the common agriculture policy, we have subsidies who have to be retaught. On the forestry, I think we have not that many forests, but we have not yet any European regulation. So carbon leakage, is going to happen primarily in the industry sector, industrial commodities. I think on cement, on steel, on basic chemicals, there we may see an important element of carbon leakage. But as of now, I would not see it yet emerging in the field of agriculture and forestry. It may come, but it's more than a decade off compared to where we are today, I would say.
Okay, then I have a last one, if you still have time.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
That whether technological neutrality has sufficiently been taken into account by government policy. To use a fictitious example, when new nuclear technology would make the renewable energy standards obsolete.
Yes, well, we are all in favor of technological neutrality. That stands up unless if that neutrality is touching upon externalities. Like on coal or on gas, there is the externality of CO2. Now, the taxonomy is not a climate taxonomy. The taxonomy is a green taxonomy. And so many more elements than carbon dioxide are entering into the picture. For gas, it's clearly carbon dioxide, but also sulfur dioxide, methane, leakages, etc., etc. That was a hot potato. Now on nuclear, there is the problem related to waste, for example, that is still not yet resolved. And so when people bring forward one or the other, then that question comes into the picture. Now, when it comes to the comparison with renewables, I would claim that all elements that are building, say, a windmill are covered by the ETS. Steel, cement, chemicals are covered by the ETS. So the externality of building a windmill is already covered through the ETS. And once the windmill is built, electricity is generated almost for free, almost for nothing. So I would be cautious in this green taxonomy and comparing technologies with one another, because climate considerations, greenhouse gas emissions, is a very important one, and the nuclear sector is not emitting greenhouse gas emissions, or very few, very limited compared to other carriers. But there are other issues that entered into the debate, such as security issues, safety issues, and of course the waste issue, as I was indicating. So a complicated debate, and I think politically very complicated. What I do think is that we should not burden the development of new nuclear developments in the future. That may be interesting. There is a lot of talk about small nuclear power stations. The jury is out how they are going to deal with the externalities, but we should be at least absolutely technologically neutral when it comes to research and development, because that is what we need to prepare for a future in which we are going to be all climate neutral. I mean, our children and grandchildren are going to live a climate neutral world, and to deliver that, we need technological neutrality, at least in the research and development efforts we are currently undertaking.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers and your insightful presentation. And now we will let you go.
Okay.
And we can advise everyone who wants to see it on the Belgian talk show Ter Zake tonight. But please stay with us. You can also look at it later for the next presentation. So thank you, Professor Delbeke.
Okay, it was my real pleasure, and thank you all, and thank you for your understanding that I have to leave somewhat earlier. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes.
So then we turn to the second presentation. I welcome Professor Deketelaere, who equally needs little introduction. He's a full professor at KU Leuven. He's Secretary General of the League of European Research Universities and Chairman of the Sustainability College Bruges. He's here to focus on the legal perspective. So good evening, Professor Deketelaere, and you have the floor.
Right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Thanks, Jos, for being with us this evening, and fully understand that you have to go on this day to Flemish Broadcasting for explaining what the Flemish government has to do on this very important topic. Thank you to the organizers to organize this event on this very timely moment. I will try to complement to what Jos has been tackling, but then primarily from a policy and legal perspective, in a sense that Jos, of course, has a kind of economic financial perspective on a number of issues. I will try to complement that with some policy, political, and legal aspects. As we already said, this is a very timely moment. 22 of April every year is Earth Day, where we try to make sure that we develop some good intentions regarding the protection of the planet on which we are living. And it's clear that this is also happening today, as you all have been understanding from Jos' presentation. But of course, the situation is not so optimal, I would say. Earlier this week, we got this very nice report by the International Energy Agency, which was indicating that global carbon dioxide emissions are set for their second biggest increase in history. So this is not really a message that we are waiting for if we talk about climate policy, development of new initiatives, climate laws, and things like that. It's clear that there is still an enormous amount of work to be done. And obviously, today is also the day that President Biden in the United States is inviting 40 world leaders to the so-called Leaders Summit on climate change, and where all of them, Russia, China, the United States themselves, the EU, but also a number of other countries, again, are going to put forward all kinds of ambitious reduction targets that they want to realize in the following decades within their own boundaries, within their own jurisdictions. When I was looking at the Belgian newspaper, The Standaard, this morning, there was a front page article saying, suddenly every world leader wants to be the greenest of the group. Well, again, my reflection was seemingly they have learned nothing from what the lawyers among us will know, the so-called Urgenda case, where the Dutch government was convicted by several courts in the country because of the fact that they have been promising too much in the past and not realizing their promises in their daily policies, notwithstanding the fact that those promises were absolutely not embedded into law. And obviously, for us lawyers, it's much more important to know what has been embedded in law, unlike what has been promised in one or the other nice environment of a conference worldwide. So for us lawyers, I must say this, well, certainly for me as a lawyer, it doesn't make a lot of impression what those world leaders are going to say there today, if that is not backed up by legislation, and legislation which at the end of the day is enforceable upon those authorities which have been promising all kinds of nice things to their population. The most steady factor or the most steady government in this whole climate policy that we have seen over the past decades is, of course, the European Union. The European Union has been this global leader on climate change, a never-changing position, unlike, for example, the United States, unlike, for example, China, unlike, for example, Russia, and also the UK in the past had its ups and downs with regard to climate policy. The EU clearly has been the world leader on the issue, and the two persons that you see on the slide, Jos already mentioned the book, another book that he has written with Peter Vis, EU Climate Policy Explained, as well Jos Delbeke as Peter Vis have been the architects of this European climate policy that we now know since, 15 to 20 years down the road. Jos was the first Director General of the newly created Directorate General Climate Action within the European Commission. And Peter Vis was in fact the chief of staff of the first climate commissioner that we ever had, Connie Hedegaard, who was commissioner for climate change in the European Commission already many years ago. So the two of them have been responsible for the policy that you see on this slide in the middle, where we have been developing policies on all kinds of issues, going from what Jos already mentioned, the EU ETS, the non-ETS, forests and land policies with regard to climate change, energy efficiency, renewable sources of energy, low carbon technologies, etc., etc. All those policies now have to be tackled by these 6 key people that you see on the slide here. And certainly a few of them will be familiar to you. Certainly at the top left, Frans Timmermans, the executive vice president within the European Commission, who is responsible for the European Green Deal, is of course the main engine behind everything that is Green Deal and climate change policy in the Union. Below him, you see his chief of staff, and I have put him on the slide also because it's important to know the background of those people. That is Diederik Samson, and Diederik Samson is, for those of you who are following a little bit Dutch policies and politics, Diederik Samson was the president of the Socialist Party. I almost said the former Socialist Party, but I think that they still exist, although they have been seen their party diminishing over the past decade, I would say, just like Timmermans, a socialist policy-wise. On the right-hand side, you see the Director General and the Deputy Director General from the present Director General Climate Action. And the Director General is Raffaele Mauro Petriccione, and he is a lawyer by training who has spent many years of his career in the European Commission in the trade department, which is for the climate policy today, a very important element in the discussion. His Deputy Director General Clara Dalla Torre has a background and a long career in DG Research and Innovation. A second element, which is, as Jos just indicated also, which is very important in the present climate change policy. Investment in research and innovation is absolutely crucial if we want to realize the targets which have been put forward by the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament over the past months and years. But it's not because of the fact that Jos has retired from the Commission that there are no Belgians anymore which are in the cockpit of the EU climate policy. Bottom left, you see Sarah Nelen. Sarah Nelen is the Deputy Chief of Staff of Frans Timmermans, has a background in the DG Environment for Circular Economy. And also circular economy, of course, is a very important element of the Green Deal and the climate policy goals that we want to realize. And bottom right, perhaps even more important, is Kurs van den Berge. He is the Special Advisor for Climate Change and for the Green Deal in the cabinet of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Just like Clara Dalla Torre, he has a background in DG Research and Innovation, but in the past also has been Chief of Staff of the cabinet of the Commissioner for the Environment, Mr. Potocnik, in the past. It's clear that with those two Belgians on board, it's clear that we still have a very good entry there in the development of the climate policy. Those 6 people are responsible now to make sure that at the end of the day, we realize the goals which have been put forward, the targets which have been mentioned. I was very glad to hear that Jos was saying, well, we have been, well, not we, but the Commission and Parliament and Council has been obsessed by target setting in this policy field. We have targets on all kinds of topics. We have targets on all kinds of policy levels. Those targets have different target years. They have different years of reference. And very often the targets are or only binding for the European Union as such, or they are binding for the member states, or they are just indicative for the member states, which makes it, at the end of the day, a very complicated set of issues, targets, policy commitments that has to be realized. And so I'm certainly not one of those people who is in favor of all those targets. Certainly of those targets are not legally binding at the end of the day and cannot be enforced vis-a-vis individual member states. So those people are now going to lead us through the realization of what Jos also already mentioned, the European Green Deal. The European Green Deal is one of the two flagship initiatives of Ursula von der Leyen. Next to greening the European Union, there's also the digitalization of the European Union. We are not going to talk about digital today. Let's focus on this European Green Deal. As she had promised when she was running for the presidency of the Commission, that she would come up with the European Green Deal 10 days after the start of the Commission. Well, she was successful in doing that because the European Green Deal was already presented by Ursula von der Leyen and Frans Timmermans on the 11th of December 2019. So clearly pre-corona, when the world was still completely different than today, they came up with this big plan. And you see on the slide, the European Green Deal is our new growth strategy. So the European Green Deal is not an environmental strategy, as you would perhaps think on the basis of the title, but it is a growth strategy. As I've said very often in the past, we have an ecological challenge, which is at the same time an economic opportunity. And the Green Deal is really embodying this idea that we have to turn this into an economic opportunity to restyle the European Union in which we are living. At the same time, as Timmermans is indicating on the slide here, we also have to make sure that this is a place which is characterized by inclusion, by well-being, by security, and by a healthy place to live. So this European Green Deal is covering a lot of issues at the end of the day. Here you see how this European Green Deal must help us realize the climate targets and the climate policy that we are envisioning. And in many policy fields, action will have to be taken in the energy sector, in the building sector, in the industrial sector, in the mobility sector. If you look closer to the energy sector, the kind of measures which have to be realized there are all about the typical goals of EU energy policy that we know, namely energy efficiency, the use of renewables, having secure and affordable EU energy supply, and have a fully integrated, interconnected, and digitalized EU energy market. Sounds all very expensive, and it is very expensive, as you already heard, but it is clear that there are enormous challenges waiting for the European Union, for the member states, for companies, for citizens, if we really will try to realize those targets in the following years and in the following decades. This slide is summarizing very well what the European Green Deal is about. As I said, it is a new growth strategy, but it indicates that we will take measures as well in the field of energy, as well in the field of climate policy sensu stricto, in the field of transport, in the field of nature protection, circular economy, which is also linked to waste policy, of course, air pollution policy, and obviously a very important element also everything that is dealing with the agricultural policy, the common agricultural policy, the CAP. You see on the slide the key actions which will be developed in each of those policy fields in order to make sure that the goals of the Green Deal can be realized. We will focus today primarily on what you see in the box on achieving climate neutrality, namely the adoption of a climate pact, the adoption of a climate law, and the adoption of a carbon border tax. We will focus primarily on that box. As Jos already indicated, all of that is going to cost an enormous amount of money. And it's clear that the Union has prepared itself for that. You see in the box financing the transition. The European Investment Bank as a European Climate Bank is now in full development. There is the Sustainable Europe Investment Plan. There is the Green Financing Strategy. Come back to that in a second. And there is, of course, what also already has been mentioned, the multi-annual financial framework of the EU, 1.1 trillion euro, and Next Generation EU, 750 billion euro. At the end of the day, the amount of that money, of the money that is going from those sources to climate change is going to be something like 30–35%, but that is certainly not going to be enough to finance the whole transition that we need. Here you see on the slide an overview of where the money will come from. Jos already tackled several elements from this slide, so I'm not going to repeat that, but it's important to know that pre-corona, the most important critique on the Green Deal as it was presented in December 2019 was that it was a fantastic plan, but that the only problem was that there was no money for it. Well, if COVID had one advantage, it is that COVID has made it possible that we not only increased the multi-annual financial framework to a certain extent, but that we have created this Next Generation EU fund, which is now going to work as a kind of trigger at EU level and at member state level to get a number of actions funded. So if you put it black and white, the money is not going to be a problem anymore, or at least not that problematic as pre-corona. The whole challenge now is to spend the money in a correct way. And that means that we need a kind of pipeline of excellent projects which are going to realize the climate goals, which are going to realize the Green Deal, and that we don't waste any money which is available on all kinds of activities or projects which are not going to contribute in a significant way to the realization of those goals. And that's why the European Union over the past few, well, let's say the past 3, 4, 5 years now, is focusing very much on what is called the green financing strategy. And certainly for the lawyers among us, you will recognize on the slide several regulations that the European Union has adopted over the past 2 years only, which are aiming at greening the financial sector, how they report, how they develop products, how they invest in specific economic activities, in specific investment projects, which are set to be green and things like that. And certainly the last regulation that you see there on the slide, that's the so-called taxonomy regulation, of which you see the subject matter and the scope here on the slide. The whole regulation is about developing criteria to judge if a specific economic activity, if we want to invest in that as a society, as a company, as a bank, if this is going to be a green investment, if this is going to be a sustainable investment. To what extent are those economic activities going to contribute to the realization of the specific environmental objectives that you see here on this slide? And Jos was correct in answering that question, saying that the European taxonomy is not only about climate change, it's also about water, it's also about circular economy, pollution prevention and control, biodiversity and ecosystem protection. These are all the criteria that we will take into account when specific decisions have to be taken with regard to the environmental sustainability of specific economic activities. And if as a society, as a bank, as a company, we want to invest in those economic activities. You will have seen yesterday that this Commission delegated regulation on the taxonomy has been adopted. This was a highly debated delegated regulation when it was in the drafting process, because as you see here in this article of Euractiv, there has been a lot of debate and a lot of discussion over the past weeks and months with regard to specific technologies, namely if nuclear and natural gas power plants, for example, can they be labeled as sustainable? Can they be labeled as activities in which we want to invest if we are aiming for a sustainable society? You see here on the slide another article from Euractiv a while ago that initially the European Commission was thinking to offer gas plants a green finance label, be it under certain conditions. Yesterday, the Commission has said, we are not going to decide upon gas plants yet. Nothing prohibits governments or industries to build gas plants. The whole question is, at the end of the day, will they get this label of being a sustainable investment? A label which is, of course, very important if you are going to banks to get a loan to finance specific projects like that. So it's clear that in the future that economic activities which will not be labeled under the taxonomy regulation as being sustainable investments, that they obviously will get less opportunity for funding through banks than we know today. Another contentious issue was, of course, what do we do with the whole nuclear sector, with nuclear installations? A few weeks ago, and you see that even on the cover of the report, the word sensitive is included. The GRC, the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, produced a report on the technical assessment of nuclear energy with respect to the do no significant harm criteria under the taxonomy regulation, because this is one of the important criteria of this regulation, do no significant harm to the environment, to the climate, and things like that. Well, in fact, the outcome of this report was that the nuclear energy sector should be labeled as being sustainable. And immediately we have seen what was the reaction of a lot of actors in the public opinion opposing this report, disputing the neutrality of the GRC. Obviously, the GRC is a scientific institution, and you expect that the whole taxonomy regulation and the technical criteria that they develop for all kinds of activities will be based on a purely scientific approach. But it is clear that this is today not the case anymore. The gas installations or the gas plants get a lot of support from Central and European and Eastern European member states because they are making this transition away from coal going into renewables, but gas there is a perfect transition source of energy for them. It is a country like France who is pushing very much to get the green label for the nuclear sector, also for obvious reasons. So it's clear that the Commission yesterday was not ready to decide on difficult issues like that. And this has now been postponed to later this year when they will take a number of new decisions on the taxonomy regulation. Now, staying a little bit still in the greening of the financial sector and the role that banks are playing in climate policy, for those which are Belgian-based, you will have seen that just a week or 2 weeks ago, the environmental NGO Climate Earth has been suing the Belgian Central Bank for climate failings. And this is, of course, because of the fact that Climate Earth cannot sue the European Central Bank before the European Court of Justice because they have no standing there to sue the European Central Bank. So what they are doing is attacking national banks which are buying bonds of companies in their country or even in the European Union to create in this difficult economic financial time a kind of economic stability in the European Union. 6 central banks are doing this for this ECB purchase program, and they do that in a kind of agnostic way, namely they buy bonds or shares from companies in an equal way, not looking at what is the CO2 emissions, for example, of those companies, of those industrial sectors from which they are buying those shares or bonds. So this has led to a lot of criticism by a number of environmental NGOs, which have been saying the ECB, the European Central Bank, should buy more bonds of environment-friendly companies and less from polluting companies in order to keep this economic balance in the European Union in these difficult times. But it is clear that not all the governors of national central banks agree with that. Christine Lagarde, who is the president of the European Central Bank, has been pushing very much for a climate approach in her policies, but she has not been successful to convince everybody about that. So we will see it's there an interesting further development between the economic financial role that the ECB is playing and the potential contradiction with the climate goals of the European Union itself. And a final point that I just want to mention on banks is that we just saw 2 weeks ago, or a week ago even, that in New Zealand, a kind of world first, they call it, but if you look at what we have been introducing in the European Union over the past 2-3 years, I'm not sure if this is a first on a global scale, but New Zealand will now force banks and companies which have a turnover of more than 1 billion New Zealand, what is that, dollars, that they will have to reveal the impact of their investments on climate change under this legislation. So also here, the financial sector will have to be very transparent on its environmental record in the following years. Leaving the banking sector and the greening of the financial sector, let's move on and see what other instruments that the European Union is presently developing in order to implement this Green Deal and to contribute to the realization of the climate goals that it has been putting forward. And let's start with a very soft instrument, namely the European Climate Pact, which has been launched at the end of last year, the 16th of December 2020. And the Climate Pact is a kind of pact between the European Union and the inhabitants of the European Union, a pact which will focus on spreading awareness and supporting action on climate change. There will be the possibility to launch all kinds of activities, initiatives with the support of the European Union, primarily in the first phase in green areas, green transport, green building, and green skills. But in the course of the next few years, the focus of the pact will be enlarged. So a very soft instrument, but which is also coming back in the next one, in the European climate law, because the European climate law is also foreseeing a specific set of dispositions on the participation of the public. And it's clear that the European climate law is going to be part, the European Climate Pact is going to be part of that. Now, as Jos already indicated, yesterday morning, the negotiators of the Parliament and the Council in the trilogue meeting number 6 or number 5, I forgot what was the exact number of trilogues that they needed, the representatives of Council and Parliament reached an agreement on this so-called European climate law. As all, Frans Timmermans was talking in big words about that, saying it is a landmark moment for the EU. Okay, that's well noted that it is a landmark moment, but if you look at the text in more detail, you will see that what I wrote myself on Twitter about this, when Ursula von der Leyen welcomed the agreement on the law, that in fact we now have been collectivizing the realization of the targets for 2030, 2040, 2050. The individual member states don't have to reach those targets on their own anymore, but it will be collective targets for the EU 27. As I will say in a minute also, there are no specific enforcement and sanctioning tools in the European climate law, which is a big disappointment, of course. And again, it has been a clear win by the member states versus an overly ambitious European Parliament, I would say. So this, because of the fact that it is breaking news since yesterday morning, but let's have a closer look on several details of this European climate law. You know, let me start perhaps with that the adoption of climate laws is a very trendy issue, a very trendy topic nowadays. We have seen in many countries worldwide that climate laws have been adopted. Last year, we also tried to do that, or even the year before already, we also tried to do that in Belgium through a proposal for even a special law in the framework of our constitutional law and legislation that we have, a proposal for a special law to introduce a coordinated policy between the federal government and the states in our country regarding climate change and the adoption of general long-term goals after a kind of devastating advice of the Council of State. Finally, the law was not adopted, didn't get the necessary majorities in the parliament to be adopted. And seemingly, the new Belgian government that we have has given up on trying to adopt a specific climate law because it is not foreseen in the government agreement for the federal government in Belgium anymore. Now, the problem with a lot of those laws is what I already just indicated, is that they formulate all kinds of nice and fantastic and supportable goals, but they always forget to foresee the enforcement tools in case that the governments don't realize the goals and the targets and the promises that they have included in this law. And so very often this leads correctly to all kinds of groups and people who are then starting legal cases before civil courts, administrative courts worldwide, in order to ask from judges that governments have to comply with the promises that they have made in all kinds of laws, which are unfortunately not enforceable, not sanctionable when those laws have been adopted. We know all the famous Urgenda case. There is the Belgian climate case, which is still pending. The first, the pleas have been made over the past few weeks, and we are now awaiting a decision in first instance. By the summer, if everything goes well, we will see what that gives. As you see, bottom left, I wrote myself together with Toby de Bakker a while ago a small booklet on climate litigation as a kind of new popular topic worldwide. But very often it is not reaching the goals that it has to reach. Urgenda has been a successful case. The question is, has Urgenda led to so many modifications in the Dutch climate policy or not? I think that a lot of people are presently disappointed. We have seen cases in Germany, in the United States, in the UK, who also didn't lead to all kinds of modifications. So my plea always is that we need clear and hard legislation which is including sanctions when governments are not complying with the targets that they have been setting, so that on the basis of those sanctions which are foreseen in the legislative framework, we can sue them before all kinds of courts worldwide. Let me come to the European climate law now. The proposal by the European Commission was already made in March 2020. It was amended in September 2020 because of the 2030 target, which still had to be inscribed. The European Parliament formulated this position already in October of last year, and the Council had a kind of partial general agreement in December also of last year, but only partial because they still had to have the discussion on what would be the 2030 target. And because after a first reading, of course, the position of the Council and the Parliament was so different, we needed the use of trilogue meetings earlier this year. And so several of them have taken place, leading to the result that I just mentioned yesterday morning at 5 o'clock, a deal was made. So what is this European climate law about now? Well, for the lawyers among us, it's important to know that it is going to be a regulation and not a directive. So a regulation which will be immediately applicable in the 27 member states. It's going to be adopted on the basis of Article 192, Section 1 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, meaning that we only need in the Council qualified majority for the adoption of the European climate law. You will remember that in Belgium there has been a discussion, will we support this European climate law or not? But in fact, it doesn't matter what Belgium is thinking about this, because already months ago, there was already enough support in the Council to adopt this European climate law. We need 55% of the member states, which are representing 65% of the population. And this was easily to obtain in the framework of the negotiations which were taking place. The law is introducing a binding EU 2050 target of climate neutrality, as was already mentioned earlier this evening. But it's really important to note that climate neutrality is a collective goal of the 27 member states, and it is a goal which has to be realized in a collective way. So that means that in 2050, it's not sure that all 27 member states will be climate neutral. It's possible that some are faster or slower than other member states. The realization of the 2050 target will have to be based on fairness and solidarity between the member states. So some will do more, some will do less, and cost effectiveness will be a leading principle in the realization of the target, meaning we will try to reduce emissions there where this is to be done in the most cost-effective way. So don't be mistaken, a collective goal and a collective realization. The Parliament has been fighting until the last evening to make this an individual target for each of the 27 member states. Climate neutrality in 2050, it has not been successful in doing that. The law also foresees that a binding target for 2040 will be set in 2023. It's still too early now to do this now. It's clear that the Parliament also wants to set this target in a very well-informed way, because they have said that they want to have a clear view on the greenhouse gas budget for the period 2030-2050, when this 2040 target is going to be settled. And thirdly, it is including, and this has been the topic of discussion for a very long time, it has been setting forward a binding EU target for 2030, where we will have to realize at least a reduction of 55% of CO2 in 2030 compared to 1990. It has to be a net domestic reduction. So that's a very important target, which now has been settled, where there is no discussion about anymore. Also here, the Parliament gave in, because the Parliament has been defending for a very long time that it had to be 60%, the reduction by 2030. You know that originally we started off from 40%. Also important is that the law foresees that we are going to create a European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change, and the secretariat of this board will be done by the European Environmental Agency in Copenhagen. Also here, the Parliament tried until the last moment to create a real European Climate Change Council, but also there they have not been successful. The law furthermore foresees what we have been already mentioning, namely that by mid-2021, and in reality that will be the 23rd of June 2021, the Commission must be ready with what is called the Fit for 55 package, and that is the revision of all directives, regulations which are existing now, how they have to be modified in order to make sure that they contribute through new targets, through new measures, to the realization of this 2050 target, 2030, 2040, and 2050 target. Also, the law is announcing the adoption of a new EU adaptation strategy, because we always talk about mitigation here, but adaptation is of course also important. The adaptation strategy was already published on the 24th of February of this year. And obviously, a very important part is the evaluation of the member states' progress and the European Union's progress and the measures that they adopt in order to realize the 2030, 2040, and 2050 target. And here I want to just mention that the Commission is going to evaluate from the 30th of September 23 on, and then every 5 years, the Commission is going to evaluate what is the progress that the European Union as a whole is going to make. And if the conclusion of that is that the European Union as a whole is not making progress enough compared to the 2030, 2040, 2050 target, the Commission will report to the Council and the Parliament and will ask them to take the necessary new measures in order to get on track again. With regard to the member states, here also the European Commission is going to do an evaluation from September 2023 on, and then every 5 years. It will report to the European Parliament and the European Council on the progress of the 27 member states. And of course, the important check there will be the National Energy and Climate Plan that every member state had to draft and had to adopt and implement. And if the Commission is seeing that member states are lagging behind, if they are not on track to realize the targets, the Commission will inform the Council and the Parliament about that, but will also send recommendations to the member states in question and indicate to them that they have to speed up the implementation of their National Energy and Climate Pact plan. The Commission will formulate recommendations. Okay, that's nice. The Commission is specialized in formulating recommendations. We know that. Member states will have to say within 6 months what they are going to do with those recommendations. And a year later, they will have to say what they have done in order to comply with the recommendation. And here we had another interesting battle between the Parliament and the Council during the trilogues, because the member states, the Council has been successful in including in the text that a member state also can say to the European Commission after 12 or 18 months, in fact, we have done nothing with your recommendation because we don't agree with your recommendation and we see it otherwise. The Parliament was very much opposed to this disposition in the law, asked for the annulment of that specific sentence, but the Council has been very stubborn and it still is in the text and it is now finally in the text. So that means that from a point of enforcement, this climate law is nowhere, I would say. What we would need is specific actions and sanctions which can be taken vis-à-vis member states, next to, of course, the Commission bringing a member state before the European Court of Justice. But we all know how long that takes and a lot of formalities which are necessary for that. So it's certainly a failure or a missed opportunity with the European climate law not to foresee sanctions vis-à-vis member states which are not complying with the targets that have to be realized at the end of the day. The law is foreseeing a number of dispositions on participation of the public. I already mentioned that. The law does not foresee on specific dispositions dealing with access to justice. And this also was a battleground between Parliament and Council, because the Parliament wanted to have specific dispositions on access to justice when it was clear that the targets were not going to be realized. The Council has opposed that and also was successful there. Finally, the law also foresees the possibility for the Commission to help specific industrial sectors which want to develop decarbonization roadmaps. And we will see how this is going to develop in the future. Looking at the clock, I will speed up a little bit so that we don't stop too late. I already mentioned this Fit for 55 package that the Commission is going to present on the 23rd of June. As Jos already indicated, major modifications of the ETS directive, but also important modifications with regard to the directives dealing with renewables and energy efficiency. If we go for a 55 target in 2030, then we will need, in fact, a new renewables target of 40%, which is quite significant. A specific renewable electricity target will be 70% then. I hope that everybody understands what that means. For energy efficiency, we will have to go to a kind of 37 to 40% of more energy efficiency compared to 1990 levels, which is also a very important target to reach. And then let me come to the final instrument that I want to tackle. That's what Jos already mentioned, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is, of course, a very important and potentially a very difficult political tool if this is going to become reality. You know that the background is that if the European Union is the only continent or the only place on the planet which is going to be so ambitious with regard to climate action, emission reduction, and if the rest of the world is going to lag behind, hopefully this is not going to be the case after the summit today and tomorrow. But if that would be the case, then of course the EU cannot afford that through its very proactive policy, all kinds of companies would leave the European Union on the one hand, and that we would have to import all kinds of products with a high carbon footprint on the other hand. So that certainly would not lead to a level playing field for those who are producing and those who are active in the European Union. As Jos indicated, we have been solving this problem up until now by giving free allowances for what we call the carbon leakage sectors, sectors which are under threat of moving outside the European Union because of the strict climate legislation. These free allowances that are given for carbon leakage sectors still can go on until 2030, but it is clear that the Commission is now thinking of replacing this by what is called this carbon border adjustment mechanism. Let me just mention two elements of this consultation and the text of this consultation, which has been launched in March of this year. The legal basis for this carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is foreseen, is in fact still not decided. The Commission indicates that it would be possible to adopt that on the basis of Article 192. But as we said earlier this evening, environmental protection measures, which are primarily of a fiscal nature, they need unanimity in the Council, and we all know how difficult that is. But seemingly there is so much support for this carbon border adjustment mechanism that perhaps this is going to be successful. A little bit more worrying is that the Commission is also putting forward as legal basis for this proposal Article 207 of the treaty, which is dealing with common commercial policy. And the worrying thing is that there is no unanimity needed, but just a qualified majority is needed for a measure under Article 207. So we will have to wait and see how this is going to develop. But certainly, if there is the risk of unanimity, that will be an important threat to the whole proposal. With regard to the design of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, there is still no decision yet about the type of policy instrument. Jos was talking about a tax, but it's not certain that it will be a tax. It can also be, for example, an extension of the EU ETS on imports. Obviously, tax tools are more possible than an extension of the EU ETS for imports, a carbon tax on selected products, a new carbon customs duty or a tax on imports are possible, of course. Secondly, it's also important to know what is going to be the methodological approach to do this. How are we going to evaluate the carbon content of specific products? How are we going to do the carbon pricing of specific products? So this is going to be still a very difficult discussion. There's also uncertainty still about the sectoral scope, which products, which industrial sectors are going to be hit by this carbon border adjustment mechanism. So still a lot of uncertainties. And as was already said earlier this evening, the rest of the world is not looking at us with a lot of sympathy for the introduction of this carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's not surprising that the Chinese President Jinping already indicated that he's not in favor of this. According to him, the response to climate change should not be a pretext for erecting barriers to trade. But a bit more surprisingly, also John Kerry, the US climate envoy, has been negative about the introduction by the EU of a carbon border tax. And obviously, all of them, the US, China, but also Russia, for example, they are going to see how they can defend themselves against such a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And obviously, there we get into the next obstacle of such a mechanism, namely, how can we make sure that it is compatible with WTO law, with the rules of the World Trade Organization. And in the past, already a lot of work has been done on that. I myself, I'm certainly not a specialist on international trade law, but a number of people, even people from our own country, are leading experts on this issue. Alice Pirlot, who made her PhD on the issue at Leuven and is now in Oxford. Alice did a fantastic PhD on environmental border tax adjustments and international trade law. But there is also, for example, this document, a briefing document for the European Parliament, which was drafted by another Belgian, namely Jos Delbeke, who is at Georgetown University School of Law. He made an analysis together with his colleagues of the trade-related aspects of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. What are the legal problems that we can expect when the European Union is going to introduce something like that? What are the obstacles from the point of view of WTO law? And Pauwelaere is not so optimistic in his analysis. Depending on the design of the mechanism, we can run into all kinds of troubles with regard to WTO law. But he correctly indicates also in his advice, and Alice has also done that in her book dealing with this topic, there is still the possibility, of course, of Article 20 of the GATT, the exception for health and environmental issues. Even if we violate WTO law, Article 20 of the GATT still can come to the rescue as long as it is a measure which is necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health, or relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources, and to the extent that this measure is not applied in a manner which would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail or a disguised restriction on international trade is taking place. So Article 20 of the GATT, very much used article in international trade law, perhaps will be the escape route from a WTO perspective for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Let me finish by saying two words about Belgium. We have been talking about the EU this evening. We have been looking at the United States, China, other countries, but how are we doing in Belgium? Well, the OECD just published, 2 weeks ago, the Environmental Performance Review of Belgium 2021, which was quite depressing reading, I must say, if you look at the content of the booklet. And what was even more surprising, if you go to the website of the OECD, this is the picture that they have next to the cover of the booklet of the Belgian review, indicating Belgium is not on track to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And I think that that this is the same message that Jos has been given just on the Flemish television earlier this evening, after that he has left us, namely that Flanders, Belgium should do everything to get on track to realize this climate neutrality together with the 26 other member states of the European Union by 2050. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry to take a little bit longer than foreseen, but I hope it was still interesting for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Deketelaere, for indeed this very interesting presentation covering a lot of topics over litigation, financial regulation, and of course environmental policy of the EU. I'll turn to the questions now. We have one from Alec van Varenbergen. If the new EU climate law removes almost all individual member states' targets and the governance and enforcement provisions, or enforcement provisions are toned down to what was already also somewhat weak in the governance regulation of 2018, will the incentive to cooperate on green projects between member states decrease? And the Commission has been promoting, for example, renewable energy cooperation projects whereby a member state that is in advance of its targets could have a less advanced member state benefit from its project in exchange for some type of financial reward. Will this phenomenon or trend disappear through the lack of binding national targets?
Well, good question, Alec. Thank you very much. And it's clear that a lot will depend on how the European Commission is going to deal with the 27 member states in the following years. I think that this is really an absolutely crucial issue. If the Commission will take a kind of flexible, laissez-faire approach by each of the 27 member states, then it is clear that we are going to run into trouble. So I hope that the European Commission is going to be following up on the member states in a very strict way, based on the national energy and climate plans that they all have to draw up, that they have been drawing up, but which they now will have to revise on the basis of the Fit for 55 package, of course. If there is a close monitoring by the European Commission vis-à-vis the member states, even if targets are not legally enforceable on the basis of the climate law itself, even not on the basis of sectoral directives, I hope still that the Commission, through a strict monitoring and recommendation policy, at the end of the day, will make it possible that member states really act, that member states are going to make use of possible cooperation mechanisms, as Alec is indicating, and so that at the end of the day, this is going to be successful. I think there is a big difference with the past, namely that, in fact, all 27 member states have been bought by the European Union now, because of the enormous amount of money which is going to be available in the following years, and certainly in the first 3 years that we are going to go now. This enormous amount of money will have to be compensated by realizations. And that's why these resilience plans, which the member states are drawing up now, are going to be so important also, so showing to the Commission that money is well spent. And if money is not well spent, the Commission is not going to pay. It's going to be as clear and simple as that. So I hope that a stricter supervision by the member states, and the fact that the money is only going to flow if they do what they have to do, is going to lead to a more successful approach than what we have known in the past, where the Commission was way too flexible on member states, way too slow on bringing them before the European Court of Justice for non-realization of targets, of commitments, and things like that. I see there's also a question by Irakli.
I think Irakli just thanked you for the presentation and that she had to. I'll look at the audience whether there are other questions. Otherwise, I'll ask you for your main takeaway of the days that we went through now. So the EU climate law, quick.
It's I would say it's all very nice. We are again in this kind of momentum that we need of political support. But I must say, being 54 now and having spent 30 years on this topic already now, I have seen too many of those political momentums where everybody is saying, we are going to do this, we are going to do that. And there's a kind of overbidding by countries now, what they are going to do, which percentage that they're all going to realize. At the end of the day, I would say we need hard law and we need clear legislation which is imposing clear obligations on countries, on member states, and which is including significant sanctions if member states don't do what they want, what they have to do. Together with that, I also would like to see much more investment still in research and innovation. It's clear that we are never going to make those goals if we don't, as a union, invest more in research and innovation. And this was one of the disappointing outcomes of this whole Green Deal negotiation and of the negotiations on the multi-annual financial framework and next generation EU, that for all kinds of policy goals dealing with climate, there was a lot of willingness at the level of the member states because they knew that they were going to get significant amounts of money. But for research and innovation, the budget has not been what it has been promised. And it's clear that if the EU is not going to follow up on this by investing much more in research and innovation than it is doing now, I'm quite pessimistic that we are going to reach those targets.
I see that there's another question or maybe comment in the chat. Is this not also in line with the general idea of an integrated EU energy market and with the idea of a largely interconnected European transmission grid, having renewable sources in the locations where they fit best?
Yeah, obviously, it's clear that we can invest here a lot in solar energy in Belgium, but probably we are not the best country to do that. Perhaps we have to invest much more in the wind or things which are dealing with rain. We see that in a number of member states where investment in solar could be much more efficient and effective and profitable, that still a number of those member states are lagging behind. But obviously, it's clear that the European Union has to develop a policy where the member states are treated equally. And they cannot say from Brussels, well, Belgium, you don't invest too much in solar, just go for wind and for something else in which you can be good. Cannot say to Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, whatever, you have to focus primarily on solar. So obviously we cannot do that from a legal point of view, but we hope that through the European Green Deal, the enormous flows of money which are coming now, that the market is going to do that the market is going to lead to a selection of locations for technologies which can then function in the most profitable and optimal way. And I'm quite confident that, for example, through the policy that the EIB, the European Investment Bank, is going to develop, that this is leading to, well, better chances of having such an approach than what we have seen up until now.
Okay, maybe a last question picking in on your last comment. What is the general sentiment about the indecisiveness? That's what I may say about the taxonomy regulation. Actually, there's two main instruments that should in fact guide investments towards green economic activities.
Well, there, as I indicated, the worrying thing is that the taxonomy regulation and its implementing acts are getting politicized in a sense that the taxonomy should be a clear scientific exercise where we make an evaluation at the end of the day. Is a specific technology not leading to additional danger, to additional harm, not leading to environmental pollution, environmental issues, because it is broader, as we said, than just climate change. And so the worrying thing is that that a number of forces are working presently at full force to influence the scientific evaluation which is made of a number of technologies. And for example, on the nuclear discussion, I would recommend, that's why I took a picture in the slide of the front cover of the document. I would recommend everybody to who is interested to have a look at this report of the GRC dealing with nuclear installations, where of course they say we have to make sure that the use of nuclear energy is going hand in hand with a fantastic security and safety policy, that we continue to invest in upgrading the technology, that we continue to invest in the storage of nuclear waste. And for example, I know that a lot of people are still using the nuclear waste argument as a kind of as an obstacle which cannot be overwon. But if you look at what is happening from a technological perspective already in a number of countries in dealing with nuclear waste, then the picture is not so gloomy as a number of people try to present it to us. So I hope that taxonomy will continue to be a scientific exercise, not a political exercise. But as you have seen, probably the Belgian Financial Times today had an article of which the title was "The Green Deal is threatened by the green taxonomy." And so obviously, if we will allow the taxonomy to be a political game, then it's also going to endanger the realization of the Green Deal.
Okay, thank you very much for those insights. I look at the chat, I don't see any more questions. So I will think we spend a little over time, but we will go end it here. Thank you very much, Professor Deketelaere, for your
pleasure.
Also to Professor Delbeke. And those who didn't have enough of environmental law this evening, we still have the Belgian talk show where Professor Delbeke will be on to discuss pretty much the same issues that we did here. So thank you very much and have a nice evening.